TFT has an evergreen system, so players don't get overwhelmed by so many different mechanics, but it keeps it fresh with new mechanics. Do you think a system similar to that is beneficial for League? We do that with preseasons. A lot of preseasons in League like cycle mechanics. Not every preseason just adds. A number of preseasons change. Obviously, it's not as much as TFT. Also, I wouldn't necessarily agree that like TFT is not overwhelming. I think like part of TFT is that you constantly have to learn new sets and things like that, and that can be overwhelming. I don't think it's a bad thing for TFT though, because it keeps the game fresh. Like half the fun of TFT sometimes is like learning the new stuff and seeing the new things. So I think like TFT is definitely like really fun, and they have a really good strategy for like creating content in an evergreen way. But I wouldn't necessarily say that like them constantly changing the set makes it like less overwhelming. Yeah. With TFT, they cycle out a lot of mechanics too, so it isn't compounding. Yeah, in League, I'd say we probably don't remove as many mechanics as we potentially should. I would agree with that. Like, you know, preseasons will add stuff, which can be good, but sometimes we need to like remove stuff as well. We did an okay job with this in the jungle, although that just creates a lot of churn for jungle players. But like, when we add something new to jungle, we tend to take away. But yeah, League over the years has gotten just more and more stuff, and sometimes that, can. I think there's a reasonable question to ask, of like, hey, is there too much stuff? What do I think about champs that do well in any matchup? Those champs can be a little bit dangerous from the game. It's okay if a champ like is a, just a safe pick. That's one thing. But if a champ like looks at the game and says, I could care less who is in it, or I could care less who is on my team, I'm just always going to succeed, that's generally, not always, but oftentimes an indication of like a lack of weaknesses or a lack of sharpness. And that can be pretty rough. A character that will sometimes have this problem is Kai'Sa. Kai'Sa, when she is strong enough, will get to up to a 50% pick rate. And you might be like, well, the pick rate's just because she's fun and popular. And like, yes, some amount of Kai'Sa's pick rate will always be because she's fun and popular. That's just true. Very fun, very popular champion. But when she's at like a 50% pick rate, it's often an indication that she's like not expressing weaknesses. And people just see her and be like, it doesn't matter who's on the enemy team or on my team. I'll just pick Kai'Sa and expect to do well, right? And that's for League of Legends, which is a game to some degree about like champion interactions and champion strengths and weaknesses. I'd say it's generally not ideal for champions to just be good into everything no matter what. That's a bit different than a champion like having mostly good matchups, but still having things they care about, where it's like, oh, I'm generally a safe pick, but I prefer laning into bruisers, or I'm generally a safe pick, but I prefer my team to have a lot of crowd control on it. Things like that. Yeah. And so it's not necessarily important that your character have like strong counters, but it is important that they look at the enemy team and be like, ooh, this is a decent Mordekaiser game. Or they look at the enemy team and be like, this isn't the best Mordekaiser game. Or they look at your team and they're like, oh, this is a great team to pick Mordekaiser with versus this other team that's maybe not as good of a combination with him. Those kind of dynamics, I think, are fairly valuable for the game. I'm working on a game, and we just had our big first round of playtests. For some of us on the team, the more negative feedback is getting into us a bit. How do you handle and work with negative feedback from playtests? So I'd say one thing to think about is negative feedback is an opportunity, especially early on, where your thing you're doing early on is probably not amazing, right? And so the first thing I'd say about negative feedback is don't always take it at like literal face value. And what I mean by that is like, if someone's like, I hated your thing, like you shouldn't immediately take away from that, my thing is terrible and I'm terrible and everything is terrible, right? But instead you could unpack like why they hated your thing, and that's an opportunity for improvement, right? And so, if someone says like, I dislike this thing, you can like potentially delve into like what's going on there and like what is causing that dislike, and then ideally adjust it or sometimes accept it, right? It really just depends on what you're looking for. Yeah, so I'd say that's one thing is like, yeah, view negative feedback potentially as an opportunity. If there's a negative feedback of something that was bad, it's like, well, hey, how do we fix it, right? How do we improve it? You also want to ask yourself if you want to fix it. Some negative feedback potentially, this is going to sound silly, but potentially shouldn't be fixed. And because it might just not be like not in the taste of the feedback giver or whatever. Now, this doesn't mean like be like, I'm the game dev and I know better, right? Like that's not what I'm saying. But mainly like sometimes it's like, hey, this person, I'll give an example. I would get players when I was making Jin who would play Jin and they'd say, you were making a cool guy, but I really didn't like him because he doesn't feel like an AD carry. And I'd be like, well, what do you like about AD carries? And they'd be like, well, I really like AD carries who can orb walk a lot and attack really fast. And Jin just doesn't feel like an AD carry. He's like a caster, right? He doesn't attack very fast. There's no way to make him attack faster. Just doesn't feel like an AD carry, and I really didn't like that. And to me, my like response to that wasn't like, oh shit, I need to change Jin. I need to like make him a normal AD carry. The response was, well, actually, that's what I'm going for. In this case, that negative feedback was affirming something I was trying to achieve, which is like Jin is like different in the AD carry roster. Now, on top of that, then I said like, well, what are I'm not going to make him attack faster, but like, what are other things about AD carries that like you really like that maybe I could help Jin out with? And that would get me good feedback of things like, oh, well, I felt his attack frame was really bad, or I felt that he, in terms of attack timer, didn't scale his attack timer fast enough to keep up with the game state. And so later in the game, I felt like I couldn't auto attack at all. And his animation for his fourth shot felt off and things like that. And so it's kind of a thing where it's like, yeah, at the end of the day, I wasn't going to give Jin his, Jin like fast auto attacks. But for somebody who likes auto attackers, there's still a lot of opportunities in that feedback session to get out of them like, well, what would make him feel better as an auto attacker. Wow, thank you for the 21 months. About to sleep and I saw the Discord notif. Have a good night. Well, thanks for stopping by. Have a good night as well. Yeah. Make Seraphine mid again. That is very unlikely to happen. Because Seraphine was never really able to, at any point past like her very initial release, hold much of a player base in mid. And so the reason we've moved Seraphine away from mid over the years is because even when she has been strong there, she's not always strong there, but even when she has been strong there, she's really, really struggled to hold a player base there. Comparatively, she tends to like do fairly well in, you know, support and AP carry, things like that. So it's kind of a thing where it's like, as another example, we're probably not going to try to make Vi, like do a ton of work to make Vi go back to top lane, even though that's what we shipped Vi as, because we shipped Vi in top lane, but it turns out that the people who like Vi wanted to play her as a jungler, and so, you know, Vi is a jungler. And so similarly, it's like, yes, we intended for Seraphine to be a mid laner, but it turns out that a lot of the people who play Seraphine, in terms of her theme and her gameplay, heavily prefer to play her as support or AP carry, even in metas where she is powerful mid. And that's the difficulty with her.